Okay, so I've supplied the lecture notes itself. So for the video lecture, I'm going to focus in on particularly what you're going to be what you need to know for your exam. So I'm going to focus mostly on the three empires. This map shows the three we're going to talk about, and just I'll just kind of talk about a helpful way to kind of remember. So the farthest to the west and closest to Western Europe is the Ottoman Empire, where present day Turkey is at. Then you have in the middle the Safavid Empire, where present day Iran is at. And then you have the Mughal Empire, which present day India is at. And so if you're trying to think, okay, how do I remember Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal? Well, first of all, I'd say for the exam, you really need to know the Ottoman and the Mughal. And just think Ottoman is closest to Europe. It takes over Constantinople in 1453 and changes Constantinople to Istanbul. And so that might help you remember the Ottoman Empire. And then with the Mughal Empire, remember that what you see here is a Muslim minority regime ruling over a Hindu majority population. And again, another thing that might help with the memory about the Mughals in India is Taj Mahal was created during the time of the Mughal Empire. So those are just some things to help put in perspective. So as I mentioned, you have the notes. The thing with the video lecture is I'm going to kind of go over the empires in general, go over the key points, and this will just help you as you kind of take the notes from the actual lecture notes. So start with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire begins in the very late 13th century, but it doesn't really make global impact, especially for modern history, until you get the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So here you have, as I mentioned earlier, this transition happens, and it's all very symbolic, right? Because Constantinople falling is like the last major city of the ancient Roman world comes crumbling down. So it's a very good like symbolic marker that we're in a new era. Um, and like 1492 and Columbus, 1453, and the fall of Constantinople, it is a good symbolic marker to say like, okay, we're entering the modern age or the beginning of the modern age. And the Ottomans are important because in a lot of ways they forced, Western Europe is going through the Renaissance and the Reformation. You all went over that already. And so one of the reasons why Europeans are exploring, one of the reasons why Europeans kind of have to learn to live together and get along is that the Ottoman Empire is a force to be reckoned with. The height of its rule is during the time period I just mentioned. It's under the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent. So he's a great administrator, a great ruler, and the greatest of the rulers of the Ottoman Empire. This is a Sunni Islam regime, and they go knocking on the door of Western Europe, as you see in the notes. They had laid siege to Vienna as early as 1529. So it was a regime Western Europe had to pay attention to. And some of the powers of European powers made alliances with Suleiman. So I mean, it is quite the social political power in the 16th century when it comes to weaponry and warfare. They are right up to speed with the Europeans, if not maybe surpassed them in some levels. Um, I would say general toleration towards the Jewish population and probably even Christian peasants may have been better in the Ottoman Empire. than it was over in Western Christian world. Um, they had this kind of specially trained force that was, loyal to the Sultan, um, named the Janissaries, and these are basically uh, boys who'd been taken as spoils of war in the Eastern European world, and trained as basically these elite fighters, and they were very, very, very like skilled and well taken care of in the empire itself. So that kind of limited the threat of takeover, or like rebellion among the Janissaries. Well, the empire as like a threat to Western Europe does fizzle out after 1571 when a alliance of Catholic regimes fight against it and win. So at that point, the Ottoman Empire doesn't really threaten expansion into the uh, Western European world. And in fact, some would argue this is where you start to see the shift happening, where the scientific revolution is going to break out in Western Europe. And the Ottoman Empire, which is the strongest of the empires, is going to kind of, Islamic empires, is going to kind of be stagnant. And so that'll force a problem for the Islamic world as time goes on. So not gonna say too much about the Safed Empire because it's not on your exam, but it's important to like take note of. This is the first Shiite empire, so this is another form of. If you think about the two major forms of Islam, it is the other form, and this is important because it now has its own kind of like state. First time you have a Shiite state empire rising. A lot of this goes back to the Persian roots of Iran, um, and frankly, early on in the story, you do kind of have this tug of war goes on between the Safavids and the who are Shiite and the Ottoman Empire who are Sunnis. So that goes on for a while. Much like one of the kind of core things among the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal Empire is they do have points where religious toleration is generally the norm. I mean, again, this is not kumbaya and everybody's holding hands and staring at rainbows, but it is probably better here, especially during than Western Europe during the time of the religious wars that we already covered. The greatest ruler out of the Soviet Empire, Shah Abbas first. He is the one who really strengthened the state, and yeah. Eventually, this state will crumble about the beginning of the 18th century by invasions from the north. And as you're going to see later, just keep an eye on this area because we're going to think about the future of the state of Iran much later in the history. But this is the situation back in the early modern era. All right, so the last of the empires is the Mughal Empire. Mughal Empire, as I mentioned before, um, late Middle Ages. You do have these after the Mongol invasions. Mongols never do really penetrate into India. They do have what I would call like a sphere of influence, but it never does penetrate. Eventually, you will get with the Mughal Empire, beginning with Babur, who does have roots to some of these late medieval Islamic Mongolian connections. You'll have this now Muslim empire rising and growing, going south, especially. You saw the map over the years. The other thing about these three empires, they all have a legitimate advancement in technology, especially in warfare. The Mughals probably maybe the best out of the three. And I would say that just because they keep the British at bay for a while when the British are trying to invade much later on, in well late 18th century, 19th century. Um, the greatest ruler here is Abu Akbar, who you need to know for your exam. Abu Akbar. Akbar is famous for having the special house of worship where he would have different people from different faiths meet and discuss religion. And again, this is just brilliant strategy. I mean, I think there is obviously interest, but it's brilliant strategy, especially if you're a ruling minority, to kind of keep religious dialogue open. Later on, Shah Jahan is the one who built the Taj Mahal, and I know your textbook has a nice little section on him that you should definitely take a look at. Um, then, as you get later into the beginning of the 18th century, late 17th century, you do have problems. It all kind of flows out of the rule of Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb is religious. He's a religious persecutor. There are religious persecution that happens, especially against the Sikhs and other minority groups. But Aurangzeb really takes it up a notch and basically alienates the population. So by the time his regime is over, you guess basically get a splintering of rulership throughout India, which does leave it, let it it becomes susceptible to take over by the British eventually. If you start to see the British colonize India, so if you think about what happens after this, so if you are looking ahead, like Turkey, Turkey generally becomes stagnant. The Ottoman Empire will last all the way to World War One. I don't know if you noticed the right. If you look at the years there, 1922. So it just kind of like lives a long life, and as we're going to dictate, states will like the Greek state will get independence in the early 18th century as a way of branching off from the Ottoman Empire. The Soviet Empire ends, and eventually it's going to become the Iranian state, and then Mughal Empire will become a British colony. The same thing will happen to Iran, by the way. The area will become under the basically Russia and Britain are trying to control this territory and colonization. Sikhism is not on your exam, so I'll leave it. I mean, look at my lecture notes. You could check that out. It's interesting as like a religion. I kind of go over the thoughts here. Maybe I'll post a Sikhism 101 video if I can find one. Um, I do would say that if you think about where does the Islamic world go, you do have two different minds about it as you're approaching the 18th century and 19th century. I'll talk more about the 19th century in a future lecture, but I do want to say in the 18th century, you do get the rise of Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia. And Wahhabism is this kind of conservative looking back to the purity of the origins of Islam. So there is a strand, like every religion, there is a strand of the faith that says, like, look, we don't like how things are going. We don't like the social political world of the current state. And so we want to like romanticize the beginning of a certain time period in history. And for Islam, obviously, that is the era of like Muhammad and the first caliphs. So with Wahhab, I think he's a very important intellectual figure because he's in some ways the root of like Islamic fundamentalism goes back to him and some other figures in the late Middle Ages. But they're mostly just expressing this idea of like wanting to go back to the basics of the religion. In some ways, you could argue Luther does that with Reformation. He wants to kind of clean up the church from what he sees as impurities of the faith. So this is what happens with Wahhabism. And in some ways, it does advocate violence in order to like bring back the regime into a more in a puritanical way. You bring back this kind of holiness. And yeah, and I mentioned about that the later Ottoman world, you will see examples of groups trying to get independence. So the Ottoman Empire, as especially into the 19th century, becomes rather weakened. A lot of this has to do with Europeans wanting to colonize this territory. And this leads to a number of massacres. I just highlighted one here because this art piece shows an example of that, and it was used as kind of propaganda in the Western European world.